Hey everybody. Now we move on to chapter 16 of the Count of Monte Cristo, the cemetery of the Chateau d'If. On the bed at full length, faintly lighted by a dim ray that entered through the window, Dante saw a sack of coarse cloth, under the ample folds of which he could discern a long, stiff form. It was Faria's shroud. All was over then. Dantes was separated from his old friend. Faria, the helpful, kind companion to whom he had become so attached, to whom he owed so much, existed now but in his memory. He sat on the edge of the bed and became a prey to deep and bitter melancholy. Alone. He was quite alone once more. Alone. No longer to see, to hear the voice of the only human being that attached him to life. Would it not be better to seek his maker as Faria had done, to learn the mystery of life even at the risk of passing through the dismal gates of suffering? The idea of suicide, which had been dispelled by his friend and which he himself had forgotten in his presence, rose again before him like a phantom beside Faria's corpse. "If I could only die," he said, "I should go to where he has gone, but how am I to die?" "It is quite simple," he said with a smile. "I will stay here, throw myself on the first one who enters, strangle him, and then I shall be guillotined." Dantes, however, recoiled from such an infamous death, and swiftly passed from despair to an ardent desire for life and liberty. "Die? Oh no," he cried out. "It would hardly have been worthwhile to live, to suffer so much, and then to die now. No. I desire to live, to fight to the end. I wish to reconquer the happiness that has been taken from me. Before I die, I have my executioners to punish, and possibly also some friends to recompense. Yet they will forget me here, and I will only leave this dungeon in the same way that Faria has done." As he uttered these words, Edmond stood stock still, with eyes fixed like a man struck by a sudden and terrifying idea. "Oh, who has given me this thought?" he murmured. "My God, comes this from thee? Since it is only the dead who go free from here, I must take the place of the dead." Without giving himself time to reconsider his decision, and as though he would not give reflection time to destroy his desperate resolution, he leaned over the hideous sack, slid it open with the knife Faria had made, took the dead body out, carried it to his own cell, and placed it on his bed. He put round the head a piece of rag he always wore, covered it with the bedclothes, kissed for the last time the ice-cold forehead, endeavored to shut the rebellious eyes which were still open and stared so horribly, and turned the head to the wall so that when the gaoler brought his evening meal he would think he had gone to bed, as he often did. Then he returned to the other cell, took the needle and thread from the cupboard, flung off his rags that the men might feel naked flesh under the sacking, slipped into the sack, placed himself in the same position as the corpse, and sewed the sack up again from the inside. If by any chance the gaolers had entered by then, they would have heard the beating of his heart. Now, this is what Dantes intended doing. If the gravediggers discovered that they were carrying a live body instead of a dead one, he would give them no time for thought. He would slit the sack open with his knife from top to bottom, jump out, and taking advantage of their terror, escape. If they tried to stop them, he would use his knife. If they took him to the cemetery and placed him in a grave, he would allow himself to be covered with earth. Then, as it was night, as soon as the grave diggers had turned their backs, he would cut his way through the soft earth and escape. He hoped the weight would not be too heavy for him to raise. He had eaten nothing since the previous evening, but he had not thought of his hunger in the morning, neither did he think of it now. His position was much too precarious to allow him time for any thought but that of flight. At last, toward the time appointed by the governor, he heard footsteps on the staircase. He realized that the moment had come. He summoned all his courage and held his breath. The door was opened. A subdued light reached his eyes. Through the sacking that covered him, he saw two shadows approach the bed. There was a third one at the door holding a lantern in his hand. Each of the two men who had approached the bed took the sack by one of its two extremities. "He is very heavy for such a thin old man," said one of them as he raised the head. "They say that each year adds half a pound to the weight of one's bones," said the other, taking the feet. They carried away the sham corpse on the bier. Edmond made himself rigid. The procession, lighted by the man with the lantern, descended the stairs. All at once Dantes felt the cold, fresh night air and the sharp northwest wind, and the sensation filled him at once with joy and with anguish. The men went about 20 yards, then stopped and dropped the beer on the ground. One of them went away, and Dantes heard his footsteps on the stones. "Where am I?" he asked himself. "He is by no means a light load, you know," said the man who had remained behind, seating himself on the edge of the bier. Dantes' impulse was to make his escape, but fortunately, he did not attempt it. He heard one of the men draw near and drop a heavy object on the ground. At the same moment, a cord was tied around his feet, cutting into his flesh. "Well, have you made the knot?" one of them asked. "Yes, and it is well made, I can answer for that." "Let's on, then." The bier was lifted once more, and the procession proceeded. The noise of the waves breaking against the rocks on which the chateau was built sounded more distinctly to Dantes with each step they took. "Wretched weather," said one of the men. "The sea will not be very inviting tonight." "Yes, the abbé runs a great risk of getting wet," said the other, and they burst out laughing. Dantes could not understand the jest. Nevertheless, his hair began to stand on end. "Here we are at last." "No, further on, further on. You know the last one was dashed on the rocks, and the next day the governor called us a couple of lazy rascals." They went another 5 yards, and then Dantes felt them take him by the head and feet and swing him to and fro. 1, 2, 3. With the last word, Dantes felt himself flung into space. He passed through the air like a wounded bird falling, ever falling with a rapidity which turned his heart to ice. At last, though it seemed to him like an eternity of time, there came a terrific splash, and he was dropped like an arrow into the icy cold water. He uttered a scream which was immediately choked by his immersion. Dantes had been flung into the sea, into whose depths he was being dragged down by a cannonball tied to his feet. The sea is the cemetery of the Chateau d'If. And we will pick up with Dantes' adventures next time. Have a good one.